Have you ever read a book where the character just sounded real? Like you could actually hear them thinking? Today we're going to talk about character voice. What makes a character sound like a real person, while other characters might sound a little too polished. And we're going to talk about how writers step inside the character's head. I'll show you how I approached Kiko's voice in Between the Waves and the Stars, and highlight another novel that does something really powerful with character voice. So let's listen a little closer to the voices that shape a story as we go beyond the pages. Welcome back to Beyond the Pages. I'm BP Lynch. Today we're going to talk about character voice. Not a point of view, not narration style. I mean the way characters actually think and speak, the language they use, the things they notice, sometimes the things that they don't have the words for yet. One thing you'll notice if you read a lot is that sometimes characters can sound a little too polished. You'll see teenagers expressing incredibly deep or emotional insight, using perfect language to describe exactly what they're feeling. And sometimes that works. Some people are very articulate. But if you think about real life, that's not usually how people experience things in the moment. Most of us figure out what we're feeling afterward. And teenagers especially are still learning how to do that. So when I was writing Between the Waves and the Stars, I spent a lot of time thinking about how Kiko would actually sound. Not how I sound. Not how I might explain things in a situation as an adult looking back. But how would he express it? Kiko doesn't always have the right words, and sometimes he repeats the same ones. Sometimes he notices things before he understands what they mean. And sometimes he just makes bad decisions because he's 18 and still figuring things out. That was important to me. I wanted him to feel like a real person who was still developing emotionally and not someone who suddenly had the perfect language for everything he was experiencing. Another piece of that I was thinking about, how people talk differently in different situations. The way you talk with your friends is not the same as the way you talk with your family. People switch language, tone, even vocabulary, depending on where they are and who they're with. That's something linguists call code switching. But you don't have to use the term for it to notice it. We all do it. So I had to think about how Kiko would talk when he's around his friends versus when he's at home, versus when he's in situations where he feels unsure or out of place, how he talks when he's at work. And that's because Kiko is living in today's world, not the early 2000s when I was his age. I also had to step outside my own experience a bit and figure out, how do teenagers talk now? What words do they use? What rhythms do they have in conversation? I didn't want to overload the story with slang. That can date a book very quickly, but I did want the voice to feel grounded in the world that Kiko actually lives in. So a lot of writing his voice came down to a simple question I asked myself over and over again. How would Kiko say this? Not how I would say it. Not how would the reader best understand it most easily. But how would this character in this moment, with this life experience, try to put what he's feeling into words? And sometimes the most honest answer was, he wouldn't fully succeed. And that's okay. In fact, that's often when the character becomes most real. Before we move on, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever read a book whose character's voice just felt incredibly real to you, like you could actually hear them thinking? If someone comes to mind, drop the book or character name in the comments. I'm always curious what voices stick with people. All right, so let's look at what this actually looks like on the page. This scene happens early in Between the Waves and the Stars in chapter 1. Kiko is out surfing with his two closest friends, Rafe and Avery. On the surface, it just looks like a normal morning on the water. They're joking around, catching waves, doing what they've always done together. But underneath that, Kiko is starting to sense that something is changing between them. One line that really captures Kiko's voice comes when he's trying to understand what he's feeling about the dynamic change between Rafe and Avery, and he's watching his two best friends interacting with each other in a way that he hasn't seen before. He says, "The longer I floated, the more I felt like I didn't belong in that world. Like they'd shifted into something new, something that didn't include me. The way they moved together, the way their smiles looked different now. Quieter, closer." That's a choice there in his voice. Instead of explaining the relationship change directly, Kiko is describing what he sees. The way they move, the way they smile. He's observing behavior before he understands what that means emotionally, but also realizing that he's now on the outside looking into a space that he once shared. Then he says, "It stirred something in me which was sharp and uncomfortable. I don't know, maybe jealousy?" Notice what's happening there. He doesn't confidently name the emotion, he's guessing. Maybe jealousy, maybe something else. That hesitation is intentional. An older narrator might say, "I realized I was jealous." But Kiko doesn't quite have that emotional clarity yet. He's feeling something strong, but he's still trying to figure out what it is in the moment. Then we get one of the lines that really defines the moment. Or maybe it was just that weird realization that everything between us was changing, that our trio was becoming a duo. And where did that leave me? That is not a polished emotional conclusion. It's a question. And that question is doing a lot of work because that's how people often experience change in real life. Not with perfect clarity in the moment, but with a quiet, uncomfortable question that lingers. Later in the scene, Kiko says something else that shows how much he's struggling internally. He looks out at the ocean and thinks, "Every wave still felt off, but I knew deep down it wasn't the ocean. I was way too stuck in my own head." And then he says literally out loud, "What am I even doing here?" And again, he's not giving us a clean explanation. He's frustrated, confused. He's searching for language and searching for someone to blame. And that's exactly what I wanted his voice to sound like. Kiko isn't the narrator who has everything figured out. He's 18. He's in the middle of an experience. And sometimes his voice is reflective. Sometimes it's funny, and sometimes it's just unfinished. He's trying to express something bigger than the words he has available. And for me, that's where the character's voice becomes really powerful. Because when a character struggles to articulate something, the reader often steps in to understand it for them. Before we move on, I'm curious about something. Have you ever read a scene where a character didn't quite know how to explain what they were feeling, but you understood it anyway? If a book or character like that comes to mind, drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think of these voices that have stuck with you. For this next segment, I want to highlight a book that does something really special with character voice. And that book is I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy Nelson. I actually just finished reading this one, and a few of the things that really stood out to me was how clearly the two narrators have completely distinct voices. The novel alternates between two perspectives, twins named Noah and Jude, but it also alternates between time periods in their lives. Noah's sections take place when they're around 13, and Jude's take place a few years later when they're 16. And what's really interesting is the difference between their voices is not just about personality. It's about where they are emotionally and developmentally. Noah's voice is incredibly vivid and imaginative. He's artistic, introspective, and the way he experiences the world is almost overwhelming. He's constantly describing things in visual and almost painterly ways, which makes sense because art is central to how he understands himself and the world around him. His narration is full of metaphors and bursts of emotion and color. He has a sense of everything that he's feeling is always happening at maximum intensity. You really get the feeling that he's younger, not because he's immature, but because everything is still new and raw for him. Then you get Jude's perspective a few years later, and her voice is very different. She's older, but she's also carrying a lot more emotional weight. She's dealing with grief, guilt, family conflict, and trying to make sense of the choices that have already been made. Her voice is more guarded. She's more self-conscious. She's still passionate and dramatic in her own way, but there's a kind of tension in the way that she narrates things, like she's constantly trying to control or manage what she's feeling. What I really found compelling is that you're not just hearing two different characters, you're hearing two different stages of growing up. And that's something that's easy to miss when we talk about character voice. Voice isn't just about personality, it's about perspective. Where someone is in their life, what they've experienced, how that shapes the way they interpret the world. When you read Noah's chapters, you're inside the mind of someone who's still discovering who they are. And when you read Jude's chapters, you're inside the mind of someone who's already made some choices and now has to live with them. So the voice shifts, not just between characters, but between moments in their life. And that's something that I think this book does really beautifully. Because it reminds us that voice isn't static. Some people don't talk the same way that they do forever. As we grow, we experience things, our voice evolves. And great writing can capture that evolution. If you've read I'll Give You the Sun, I'd love to know what you thought about the two narrators. Did one voice resonate with you more than the other? Or is there another book that you read where the character's voice felt incredibly distinct? Let me know in the comments. I'm always looking for new books with unforgettable narrators. All right, so we have a few moments left, so I always want to save some time to take some questions. So these are a few that I've gotten from readers or people at events. So the first question is, how do you make your characters sound real and not like you, the author? Well, one thing that really helps me is research and observation. When I'm working on a character, I try to get a voice in my head, and sometimes that voice is based on someone I know, or sometimes it's an actor, sometimes it's even an audiobook narrator. That voice, when I write dialogue or internal thoughts, I actually hear that line in that voice. And if that line sounds weird when I imagine that person saying it, that's usually a sign that I'm a little off. Another thing that I'll do is literally read that line out loud, because when you hear it spoken, you can tell very quickly whether it sounds natural or whether it sounds like, well, an author trying to sound clever. People repeat words, they interrupt themselves mid-thought, they don't always say the perfect thing. So letting the characters sound a little messy sometimes actually makes the voice a little more real. Question 2. Do you outline your novels or do you figure out the story as you go? I used to be much more of a figure it out as you go kind of writer, but over time I found that outlining actually helps me a lot, especially on the more recent projects, including Between the Waves and the Stars. That doesn't mean the outline is fixed. Think of it more as a map, and it helps you to see where the story is going and what major moments you're working toward. But sometimes when you're writing, the story starts to move in a slightly different direction. When that happens, I go back to the outline and I ask myself a question. Is this just a tangent that needs to get back to the original path? Or is the story actually telling me it wants to go somewhere new? If it's the second one, I'll adjust the outline. So outlining isn't about locking a story in place. It's about giving yourself a structure you can always revise as the story grows. All right, question 3. How much of Between the Waves and the Stars is based on your own life? There's a bit. While Kiko and I are definitely different people, there's also some similarities between us. But that's also true for myself and Dylan and some of the other characters. The story itself is not autobiographical, but the events in the book definitely didn't happen to me the way that they happened in the story. But what carries over often is the emotional experience. Sometimes the plot point is completely fictional, but the feeling underneath it, confusion or excitement, heartbreak, hope, that part might come from something real. So the characters are not me, but pieces of my perspective, my experiences, or things I've observed in my life definitely find their way into the story. All right, question 4. What advice would you give someone who wants to start writing but doesn't quite know where to begin? Honestly, just write. Even if it's terrible, even if it's something you never show another person ever. Writing is a skill, and like any other skill, it develops through patience and practice. You can try things like responding to prompts or joining workshops, or just experimenting with different kinds of stories. Over time, you'll start to figure out what resonates with you. And one really important question to ask yourself, though, is what do I actually want to say? Because the stories that matter most usually come from that place. If you can, find people you can trust to read your story, read your work. That can make a huge difference. People who will be honest with you, not just supportive, but honest. And the key to learning is to be able to receive that honesty in a constructive way. I've been very lucky to have a few people like that in my life, and they've helped me grow enormously as a writer. And if you've got questions you'd like me to answer in a future episode, feel free to drop them in the comments or shoot me a message. I love seeing what people are curious about. Well, that's where we're going to leave things for today. We talked about character voice, what makes a character sound authentic, and why I believe that sometimes the most realistic voices aren't the ones that are perfectly polished. We looked at how that came through with Kiko in Between the Waves and the Stars, where part of his voice comes from the fact that he's still figuring things out. He doesn't always have the language for what he's feeling, and that's intentional. And we looked at how I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy Nelson shows two narrators whose distinct voices are based on their age, experience, and where they are in their lives, as well as their personality. If there's one takeaway from today, it's this. Voice isn't about sounding impressive. It's about sounding honest to the character. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. What books have characters whose voices really stuck with you? Let me know in the comments. Next time, we're going to build on this idea and talk about point of view, how the perspective you choose changes the distance between the reader and the narrator, and how that shapes what we understand about the story. Always remember, your story matters. Keep dreaming, keep turning those pages, and I'll see you next time when we go beyond the pages.